Welcome to Framework and Formula for Writing Meaningful IEPs. This is the third module on how we think about and write criteria. In particular, in this first lesson, we're going to talk about what will convince you that the child now has access, participation, and is making progress. So we're in Module 3, which is all about selecting criteria, and we're on the first lesson, which is what will convince you, in particular, that the child is making progress. So in general, federal law in the United States, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act, or what we call IDEA 2004 at the time of this recording, allows progress to be monitored in two ways. And hopefully you had time or will make time to read the information about the difference between progress and performance, because that will help you understand where this module is headed and this lesson in particular. But the two ways that federal law in the United States allows progress to be monitored is quantitatively and qualitatively. So think of that as numbers and words. So I can tell you that it's 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Yes, I know those are with words, or I can write 32 degrees. And then I can use the word, it's cold outside. Both would tell you information about the temperature. There's actually another way, which is visual. And so you can look at a thermometer and determine if it's cold, if it's hot, but then all of that is relative to what you feel, right? Even sometimes on your phone, it'll say what is the temperature and what's the real feel, but each of us is a different person. So the question underlying progress is, what is the progress desired by the team, and what will convince you that you have achieved the direction that you headed, really achieved the goal that was set in the IEP. So we sometimes call these dimensions of behavior. This is what we really care about. I know we spent in Module 1 a lot of time talking about what's IEP worthy, what's functional, what's measurable, and all of that in the end is what matters. And we'll talk more about that in lessons 2 and particularly 3 of Module 3. But for now, try to understand that there's a dimension of the behavior that we care about that we don't often talk about. And this is going to relate back to how you write your baseline, which is your present level. It's going to go back to how much progress should be seen this year. It really comes down to these dimensions of behavior. So let's take each one at a time. So think about the first one in terms of how often do you brush your teeth? And that is a question or a dimension of behavior that we call frequency. So when we think about measuring frequency, or what will convince me that the child is able to do something more often or less often, whichever is desired. Normally when we write IEPs, it's always about what we will gain versus what we will stop doing. We can think of it in terms of, remember, numbers and words, or quantitative and qualitative. So if I have the number 32, that's the left-hand side of the screen if you're watching the video, or if you're just listening, make two columns. One column or pile is where you'd put numbers, and then the other is where you would do words. So how often or how many or the number of times a child does something is what we call frequency. And if we want to measure, or I'll be convinced that there is progress using numbers, I can do things like the number of times the child initiates, the number of times the child manipulates, the number of times the child participates. I'm telling people in my baseline, I'm telling people in the criterion of the IEP statement that what we care about is frequency. If I want to use words or descriptions, remember that word cold, I can say something like on each occasion, or daily, or the majority, or above average. This is a description, or using my words to highlight frequency. The second dimension of behavior, think or imagine a target, and what your goal is, no pun intended, is to hit the target in a specific place. We call this dimension accuracy, how well something is demonstrated. So are you on target, right in the center of the bullseye, or are you near? Is it an approximation? So when we care about the dimension of behavior called accuracy, we can write our baseline data in our present level and our criterion statement on our goals and objectives, again, using numbers or words. So if I want to say to the team, or the team's trying to convey that what we're worried about is how well, or what's expected, or how do we intend the child to demonstrate something, we can use that left column or pile, which is like number of correct, number of right, number of steps. You can even use percentages, those get us in trouble quickly. The number of times versus with words, which is accurately, correctly, intelligibly, precisely, exactly. Those words convey accuracy. The third dimension of behavior, I want you to imagine, or you can see this ruler, and rulers can measure the length. In particular, we're going to measure the length of time. So we're going to measure the length of the latency. And latency is the amount of time it takes for the child to respond once there's an antecedent or a trigger or a prompt, however you want to think about this. But it's the length of time that we measure between a prompt, an antecedent, and the child's response. So again, I can use that left-hand column or that pile with numbers, and I can talk about the time between the direction that was given and the child's response, the time between the cue that was delivered and the child's response. Or I can think of that other pile or that other column, which is much more descriptive, and I can say something like within the allotted time, within a reasonable time, after calming down. So it's much more descriptive and it's not a particular quantity. The next dimension of behavior is going to also feel like time, but we're going to think of this one in terms of measuring duration, how long something lasts. And so the what is lasting can be a whole variety of things, but we really want to think about how long the behavior or set of behaviors lasts. And we can convey that again in our baseline, again in our performance criteria using numbers. So how long a child participates, how long the child works, how long the child stays and plays near peers. So it's an actual amount of time that we can record and document with numbers. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes. We can also describe how long a behavior can last across the majority of the school day, throughout supper, while at Target. So however long the shopping trip lasts, that's how long we want the child to be able to, whatever the behavior is that is of the target. So this is duration. Sounds like we're measuring, but instead of the amount of time between something, we're looking at how long the behavior lasts. The next one, which sounds like the previous one, which was duration, now is about endurance. So I want you to think about running a race. Endurance is sort of about this stamina, right? Your ability to keep running. So it's the same behavior, running for however long the distance of this race is. It's not different behaviors mixed for a length of time, but rather it's the same behavior repeated over and over and over. And so in that first column or in that first pile about numbers, we can talk about how many steps a child takes, how many exchanges a child makes, how many objects a child can count. And again, that's really about the same behavior being repeated. We can also describe it in terms of persistence or perseverance by overcoming challenges during most of the activity or the event. Now, see, that one sounds a lot like duration, but again, it would be back to the behavior would be the same thing, like remains with the group during most of the activity. So it's the same behavior for a length of time that is really needing to be repeated. So I can remain. The next one, if you think about, is a little bit harder for us to measure. So these last two we don't use as often, though they may be important in select cases. And so if you think about something in terms of its intensity or its force, we're really thinking about this dimension of behavior that is getting at the effort at which the child has to use or apply for the behavior to occur. And again, we can do that with numbers. So the number of objects broken or spills or number of complaints or the percentage of, and you kind of fill that in. But again, these get a little bit harder to measure because we may not have a device that measures intensity or force or effort. The qualitative, again, can be very descriptive, loudly, softly, lightly. And so that's a way of describing or conveying that we care about intensity. And the last one, if you think or imagine the Statue of Liberty, oftentimes that is symbolic or representative of independence. And so when we think about how independent a student might be, what will convince you that they have made progress, what will show us that they have, let's say, quote unquote, responded to instruction, is the degree to which they have gained independence. This is again a little bit hard because we don't want to get into too much about the instructional effort and things like hand over hand, with a visual prompt, most to least prompts. These are teaching strategies that we may use to help a student gain independence. And that might be a little bit too much detail for an IEP, which is the broader plan, not the lesson plan. So sometimes this hierarchy of independence is better served in a lesson plan and not in the IEP document. But again, as with the other dimensions of behavior, we can think about the amount of support needed, the ability to initiate, be spontaneous, be independent in the left-hand column or pile, which is with numbers, or in the right-hand column, which is that idea of being descriptive. So versus for numbers, we can think of the number of times a child initiates versus the number of times they respond. Initiating is more independent than being in a responsive role. The number of spontaneous interactions, so the number of times a child sort of does it without us having to remind them. And again, anything you do in terms of ratings, percentages, or raw numbers would be that quantitative. The qualitative, again, is descriptive. None, partial, sometimes emerging, without reminders. We're describing what their level of independence might look like. So the important thing is that we really have a conversation that way back at our present level, maybe even way back to the evaluation, that we're getting the right information about what will convince me that this child has made progress towards something that matters. And again, in subsequent or other module lessons, we'll talk about what it means to matter. You can also go back to Module 1 or start at Module 1 about functional, and that hints at it as well. But we're really asking the question about what are the dimensions of behavior, from frequency to duration to independence. In the next lesson, we'll talk about this relationship between what will convince you and what you can manage in terms of data collection and monitoring the measure.